Now let's keep this short and sweet. You guys have things to do this weekend. Let's go ahead and kick it off with quarterbacks, starting with the S tier. It is all guys. All 7 of these quarterbacks are top 8 in points per game. The only guy that's missing is Patrick Mahomes, and that's because he's on bye. Bo, he's also in S tier for me. Incredible week last week against the #1 ranked defense, so I'm officially a Bo-lever. In A tier, we start to have a little bit of question marks, and rightfully so. Matthew Stafford versus the San Francisco 49ers. He leads the NFL in passing touchdowns. He's #1 in passing yards per game. I'm not including Brock Purdy because his 2 games don't really count when we're in week 10. But yeah, Matthew Stafford is running super hot with passing touchdowns. He scored 25 points per game in 4 of his last 5 games. The one game he didn't was a 1-touchdown game. I'd venture to say that one game is more of an outlier for the NFL's passing touchdown leader. In Caleb Williams versus the Giants, we've seen Caleb Williams have monster games against bad defenses. In 4-point passing touchdown leagues, just last week against the Bengals, who are second easiest matchup for quarterbacks, he had 37 points. In week 3, he faced the Cowboys, which are the easiest matchup for quarterbacks, and he scored 29 points. Now, this week he gets the Giants. It is the 4th easiest matchup for quarterbacks over the course of the season, and they've allowed the most points to quarterbacks over this past month. Baker Mayfield versus the Patriots. He hasn't been the same Baker we saw earlier in the season when he had all of his weapons. Now, coming out of the bye, hopefully Baker has been able to heal and rest up. He's practicing in full on Wednesday. He's had 2 bad games before the bye, but he was also dealing with a knee issue. And that's most likely what led him to have 0 rushing attempts. And that's really important because over the last 2 seasons, he's only had 1 game with 0 rushing attempts. And as you can imagine, that was one of his worst games. And going on to B tier, starting it off with Jared Goff. He gets to play the Washington Commanders. It is the 3rd easiest matchup for quarterbacks on the course of the season. And the Commanders just lost cornerback Marshawn Lattimore. The matchup is super easy. He hasn't hurt you in any of your fantasy starts so far this season. With the Lions, it's always a possibility that the run game gets going and takes over, so Jared Goff doesn't have a great game. Daniel Jones versus the Atlanta Falcons in Berlin, a 6th hardest matchup for quarterbacks this season. Until these last 2 weeks, they haven't let any quarterbacks throw for over 200 yards. In Danny Dimes' worst 2 games this season, he was pressured a ton. Now he gets to play the Falcons, who blitz at the 2nd highest rate in the NFL, so it's certainly a risky play here in Week 10. And Sam Darnold versus the Cardinals, he had nearly a perfect game when we saw him on Sunday Night Football versus the Commanders. I talked about how easy the Commanders are for quarterbacks when I talked about Jared Goff. The Cardinals are a much more difficult defense, just allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. They really shut down the Cowboys offense on Monday Night Football. The only bad game outside of the season opener for Sam Darnold was Week 7 against the Texans, who are #1 against quarterbacks. Jordan Love versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, I'm not sure if this is a hot take or not, but I'm not sure that the Packers offense is as good as we think that they are. We saw them lose in Week 9 to the Panthers in Green Bay, 16-13. Not to mention, in Love's 3 games over 20 fantasy points this season, were against the 1st, 3rd, and 5th easiest matchup for quarterbacks. Eagles are not even top 10 easy matchups for quarterbacks. Jordan Love reminds me a little bit of Caleb Williams. You are really excited to play him in bad matchups, but this isn't one of those. Now in C tier, we do start it off with J.J. McCarthy. He gets to face off against the Baltimore Ravens. I talked about him as a streamer this week in my waiver wire video. McCarthy hasn't thrown for 160 yards in any of his first 3 starts. It doesn't mean he can't, but the Ravens defense on the season has been friendly to quarterbacks. They've allowed 260 passing yards per game. However, over the past month, the Ravens have allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. Jacoby Brissett versus the Seattle Seahawks. Since taking over in Week 6, he's 3rd in passing yards per game and 10th in fantasy points per game. Now, the Seahawks, they are a good defense, but he's already played against good defenses this season, so it shouldn't scare you too much. It's probably the name value that's putting Jacoby Brissett into C tier, but he probably deserves to be at the end of B tier, to be honest. Marcus Mariota versus the Detroit Lions. Mariota has been serviceable in his starts. He's had some bad games against really tough defenses, but the Lions shouldn't scare you too much. Over the past month, the Lions have given up the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, and Marcus Mariota is running a ton. And Michael Penix Jr. versus Indianapolis Colts. Again, this is that game that is in Berlin, coming off his 2nd best game of the season. It's funny that when you target your #1 receiver, what that'll do for you. Now, the story of Michael Penix has been 2 good games, 2 horrible games, and 3 serviceable games. The Colts are middle of the pack versus quarterbacks, but adding Sauce Gardner to that defense, it could be another bad game for Michael Penix Jr. And again, I said we're going through these guys quickly here. B tier are really the last set of guys that I want to talk about. Aaron Rodgers versus the Chargers. The Chargers have allowed only 8 passing touchdowns this season, and they're 4th on the course of the season versus quarterbacks. He's safer than Justin Fields, but I don't see crazy upside here. And then Justin Fields, it's against Cleveland. So 1, we don't know if he's the starter. 2, the Browns, they're 7th best against quarterbacks, and it's a 37.5 point over-under. It's the lowest of the week. And 3, if you start him, you've got to be willing to accept that he could get you either 4 points or 25 points, or be benched at any point in the game. Then I'm combining all these guys together in E and F tier, starting it off with Davis Mills. He faces the Jags, who have allowed the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, but it's still a 37.5 point over-under, so I don't really like that. No one is starting Bryce Young, or at least I hope not. He's only had 200 yards or more in 1 out of his 8 starts this season, and the other guys in red all face defenses that have allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks or worse. I like Geno with Brock Bowers back, but not against Denver. I like him much more in Week 11 versus the Dallas Cowboys, so you will see him much higher there. All right, now moving on to tight ends. Let's kick it off with S tier. 2 guys you know and love. Trey McBride, he should be the tight end 1, or at very least the tight end 2 rest of season, because Jacoby Brissett feeds him the ball. And Brock Bowers, you're not benching him after what he did in Week 9. Not a great matchup, but it's Brock Bowers. And then in A tier, this is where you start to have a few more questions, but Oronde Gadsden versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers are one of the easiest matchups for tight ends, allowing the 3rd most fantasy points. George Kittle versus the Rams. Now, I like him a lot more if Brock Purdy suits up, but he's probably not going to suit up here this week. His splits with Purdy and without Purdy are night and day. That being said, it's not a great matchup, but he's been better in some bad matchups here recently. In Sam Laporta versus the Commanders have allowed the 6th most fantasy points to tight ends. He's coming off his best game of the season. Funny enough, 3 out of his 4 best games this season have resulted in a Lions loss. Almost probably unrelated, but he's not normally a volume guy, so do keep that in mind. And Dalton Kincaid versus the Miami Dolphins, it's the 5th easiest matchup for tight ends, and he's been the high ceiling play for the Josh Allen-led Buffalo Bills. And Tyler Warren versus the Atlanta Falcons. Now, you might be a little upset that he's a little bit lower, but I'll explain myself. No matter how you spin it, the Falcons are great against tight ends. They've allowed the fewest fantasy points to tight ends, fewest yards, and only 1 receiving touchdown to tight ends this season. I think he's certainly still in play because talent can sometimes supersede a bad matchup, but I just wanted to lay out all of the details. And going into B tier, I started off with Kyle Pitts. It's in a good matchup. I'm not playing Pitts over Tyler Warren, though, because I understand how the ceiling can work with Tyler Warren and that offense. But Kyle Pitts versus the Colts. The main weak spot on the Colts' armor has been the tight end position. They've allowed the 4th most fantasy points to tight ends over the season and the 3rd most fantasy points to tight ends over this past month. Now, Colston Loveland, people are going to have a lot of questions. Do I start him or not? He gets to play the Giants. I had him highly ranked last week because he played the easiest matchup for tight ends. Now, I didn't have a clue he was going to go for 118 yards and 2 touchdowns, but I did like Loveland a lot in last week's matchup. The Giants are much better against tight ends, but after a breakout game for the number 10 overall pick in this year's draft, you got to think that they're going to stick with getting him the ball some more. And Harold Fannin versus the Jets, it's the lowest over-under of the week. It's 37.5 points. Since Dylan Gabriel has taken over among tight ends, Fannin is 3rd in targets and receptions, and he's 10th in receiving yards per game. What that means is he's better in PPR leagues, but he's still solid in half PPR or standard leagues. In C tier, you're going to notice a theme here. I like volume over touchdown variance, but if you like to chase touchdowns, this is the tier that you're going to be looking at. Cade Otton versus the Patriots. Now, since Mike Evans left in Week 4, Cade Otton has been 6th in targets and receptions and 10th in receiving yards per game. He should have more touchdowns considering he has 0 on the season. He should have at least 1 or 2 considering his volume. The touchdowns will come at some point, but what is a little concerning is he has 0 targets inside the red zone since Week 4. In Dallas Goedert versus the Green Bay Packers, he's got a career-high 7 receiving touchdowns, and we're only halfway through the season. He can have random spike games. We've seen that this season, but the touchdowns are running hot. And if you look at who he's got coming up as some of his upcoming matchups, he's got the Packers, Lions, Cowboys, Bears, Chargers, and Bills. So the Eagles will probably have to score a lot of touchdowns to keep up. And Theo Johnson versus Chicago. Since Jackson Dart took over in Week 4, only Jake Ferguson, Dallas Goedert, and Devontae Adams have more receiving touchdowns than Theo Johnson. With most tight ends, a touchdown is what you're hoping for when they're not volume dependent, and he's been great in that touchdown department. Now, Mark Andrews versus the Vikings, much like Goddard, he can have breakout games, but the volume isn't really there. He's eclipsed 30 yards in one of his 5 games with Lamar this season. And in D tier, I do start it off with some other guys that could see an uptick in targets in their offense. Dalton Schultz versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Decent in all the games he's played so far outside of the game with no Nico Collins, funny enough. And the Jags are the second worst defense versus tight ends. Now, Hunter Henry versus the Bucks. If Kayshon Boutte ends up missing this week, it could be more targets his way in a game that's projected to be really high scoring with a 49.5 point over-under. And Mason Taylor versus the Cleveland Browns. It's the lowest over-under of the week. It's 37.5 points, but he should be the second receiving option for this offense. And then Juwan Johnson versus the Carolina Panthers. Fun fact, in 2019, both rookie quarterback Tyler Shuck and 6-year NFL vet Juwan Johnson both played together in Oregon. Now, that's just a little funny stat. Doesn't really mean too much, but Juwan was second in targets in Tyler Shuck's first and only start, only behind Raheed Shaheed. Now, Shaheed is gone, so it really just leaves Olave and Juwan Johnson to soak up the targets. And then I'm combining E and F tier together. It's David Njoku and Zach Ertz. Njoku, still good, but Fannin takes a lot of work away from him. And then Ertz, he's been pretty awful in games with Marcus Mariota this season, so I'm basically avoiding him. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about defenses and wrap this thing up. The first two I'm talking about, they are elite defenses, and they also play not great offenses. They're playing the 21st and 29th offense in points per game. And then the other 3 defenses are playing against backup quarterbacks or quarterbacks that probably should be backups. And then in A tier, I am starting it off with the Seattle Seahawks. There are a lot of great defenses playing against not so great offenses. And then you have the Panthers. I think they're a decent defense. And when you play against rookie quarterback Tyler Shuck and Alvin Kamara, who hasn't rushed for over 31 yards in 5 consecutive games, that's always a plus. And then going into B tier, I started off with the Patriots versus the Buccaneers. They got not so many weapons. I'll be honest, you're hoping for an immobile Baker, as I talked about his knee issue, or that they turn over the ball in this one, because it's projected to be pretty high scoring. Now, the Ravens versus J.J. McCarthy, who hasn't thrown for over 160 yards in each of his first 3 starts, and the Ravens' defense is looking much better. And the Jets versus the Browns. The Jets just traded away 2 key defensive superstars on their team, so it's a little sketchy. But the Browns' offense is 30th in points per game and 31st in yards per game. And then in C tier, I do have some good or great defenses playing against middle-of-the-road or better offenses. I like these defenses, but I don't love the matchups in Week 10. And then going over to D tier, it's the last of the defenses I could possibly recommend streaming in a 12-team league. A sneaky one is the Eagles versus the Packers, considering the Packers just lost in Green Bay to the Panthers 16-13. And then in E tier, I do have the Saints. This is a bet against Bryce Young and possibly no Rico Dowdle in Week 10. And then F tier, it's just for all of you guys playing in much deeper leagues. No, this doesn't mean these defenses are trash. It just means I don't like the matchup. And that's it for quarterbacks, tight ends, and defenses. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications. I do go live each and every single day. We're talking about player trades, fantasy football philosophy, start sits, you name it, we're talking about it. And if you want to check out my rest of season rankings, they're in the link in my bio.